So first, I want to give you a little background on Slack. And this is not intended to be what is the product, because thank you all so much for using it, but more about the culture. And I want to set the stage for the culture because it's important to understand the context in which these experiences happened. And so Slack is very much a product-led company. How many of you work at product-led companies? Now, how many are at engineering-led companies? Oh, fascinating, the vast minority. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. And that's really important, the product-led piece, because at the end of the day, it is often product managers who are held accountable for the decisions and not engineering managers. Now, we are also very explicitly an enterprise company. We are an enterprise SaaS. We're not in consumer. And then finally, about our engineering culture, we're very pragmatic. We have a huge bias for action and incrementalism. Now, with that in mind, let's begin our journey. So, about 3.5 years ago, I was looking for a job. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I looked at the home screen of my phone, and I looked at the apps that I used every day. And there in the middle was Slack. And I had started a company before, I used the product, and I thought, wow, this is really awesome, I want to work there. Now, when I joined, we didn't have an infrastructure team. There were about 100 people in engineering, and I joined Developer Platform because I had built on the platform, I had used our APIs, I'd reported bugs in our APIs, that's my favorite part. And I spent about a year leading Developer Platform with another engineering director and having a blast. Now, after my first year, the CTO comes to me and he says, are you interested in building a new engineering organization here? Guess what it was? Everyone's like, what was it? It was, surprise, it was infrastructure. And what I found particularly fascinating and interesting about this was, before Slack was the product that you're using now, it was a game. It was a massive multiplayer online game. And the infrastructure that was built by the co-founders to broadcast information about player movements, that's pretty similar about infrastructure needed to broadcast messages, to broadcast notifications, to broadcast mentions that someone has mentioned your name in a channel. So that original infrastructure actually got us really far, like surprisingly far. But suddenly things were starting to break in really strange, fascinating, and highly unusual ways. Does that resonate with anyone? Awesome. So the CTO says, we want to build infrastructure, will you do it? And to be really frank, like it was not, I didn't immediately say yes. I mean, I feel like that's one of the, if anyone offers you something that sounds awesome but also like kind of crazy, like think about it for a while. And so I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking like, do I want to do this? What are the pros? What are the cons? And the biggest leadership challenge that I saw in this role was, I want to build an engineering-led organization in a product-led company. So I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to do this. And I'm starting to talk to some of the original engineers that were in product engineering, but were like mega frustrated all the time because they wanted to build infrastructure. And they couldn't build infrastructure because their priorities were always around building user-facing features. So I started to dig in, and I'm like, so what are some of the challenges I'm concretely talking about? So user presence. How many of you all have built systems? And when I mean presence, I mean away, offline, green dot, meaning you're online. How many of you have built those types of systems before? So thank you all, because these are actually very hard systems to build. In the early days of Slack, the product was designed for small and medium teams. And so when you open up your computer, we establish a WebSocket connection, and we send a lot of data across the WebSocket. And we were broadcasting every user presence change to everyone in the organization. And let me tell you, if you're walking from meeting to meeting, you're on mobile, internet goes down, you're like me, you get on Caltrain, there's a lot of updates that are sent. So maybe for like 50 people, you might actually care if like someone's online or off. Like, you might actually know about all those 50 people. But if you're in an organization with 10,000 people and you're getting updates about 10,000, this person is away, this person is online, you end up in this situation. So this is an O of n squared problem, and we were spend 80% of the traffic across the WebSocket was user presence. Like this, so when we first got the team together, this was like the ticking time bomb, and there have been like many throughout the course of our infrastructure journey. This was a huge ticking time bomb because we could pretty accurately predict our growth, our user growth, and so we knew like D-Day was coming, and everything would implode because we wouldn't be able to handle the scale of these updates. And so this is a canonical example of the type of work that my organization does. And so when I did finally decide to take the plunge and to lead the organization, I felt very lucky to have engineers that were already working on this type of problem. And it's a story for another time about how we solved it, but TLDR, we shifted to a publish-subscribe model. All right. One of the things I also learned in reading a lot about infrastructure at other companies is that we all think that we have unique problems. And when I started reading about some of the original enterprise SaaS companies, Salesforce is an example, they had an infrastructure crisis as well. Jeff Weiner, I've seen him spoke many times, the CEO of LinkedIn, infrastructure crisis. It seems like most of us hit this point, and I just called it this offhandedly, where suddenly the infrastructure that got you here will not be the infrastructure that gets you to that next phase. And that's why it's actually quite exciting. So let's see. So I take this new like wild job, and I don't quite know what the expectations are. But one of the things that I realized was it was really, really important for an organization where most of the time people expect the stuff we build to just work. And if it is just working, then you're being successful. But then people often say, do we need to give that group more headcount? Do they really need more budget? The stuff's working great. And so I knew from day one it was really, really important that I evangelize the organization. And I talk about what's really important and why are we building the things that we're building. Because I knew that there would be a day that would come when we would have to have, and we're all managers here, we'd have to talk about budget and headcount. How many of you all spend a lot of time talking about budget and headcount? Oh my gosh, you're my people. We also decided that we were going to follow the same process as the rest of the company. So we were starting to undertake some infrastructure projects that were going to take years to finish. Some of them are still going. But the company plans in quarters. And so I wasn't going to invent a new process. I wanted to continue using the existing process that product engineering used, that our iOS, our Android clients, all of the company was used to, so I could sit at the table and give updates and talk about the work at that cadence, even though it may not necessarily finish in a quarter. Let's see. All right, so that was kind of the first 6 months of this, this wild infrastructure ride. Now we hit 2017, and I want to talk a little bit about the technology stack because this becomes relevant later. So we run a really large PHP, now increasingly hack monolith. Is that surprising to anyone? No. No one is surprised. That's great. Often people are like, oh, we heard you're all microservices. We're not microservices. But we do have, and when this was, of course, 2 years ago, we did have one, like the original microservice that we were running. And this was a service written in Java by one of our co-founders. And that was that original service that broadcast the player movements when Slack was the game glitch before it became Slack, the product we use today. And this service was like super bespoke, very hand-rolled. We were also starting to hit performance problems, and we were building out our caching system. So we decided to build that in Go, again, as a service. And these services, we didn't have SLAs for them. They were deployed in different ways. we often found like we would have to build handwritten rate limits, all of the things that like we're like very early in the services world. And while we're building these out in our new organization, things are continuing to break in strange ways. So at this stage, I'm under incredible pressure to hire. Because the engineers building those services are like, we are human single points of failure. We need people to help us. Things are breaking. You need to hire the people, like get them in the door, get them here right now. And this was actually a really difficult moment for me because I'm also feeling this pressure from like senior leadership to be like, build your team, ship those updates, like build out this infrastructure. And I had to really push back to say, we don't, as a company, really know how to hire infrastructure people. Like, what does it mean to hire someone who works on infrastructure? How do we do that? How do we structure the interview process to ensure that we're actually hiring for the things we want versus just having a biased process where people just talk to each other about computers? And so one of the big tasks that I did after I worked with the incredibly talented team on our vision and our mission was figure out how we are going to hire these generalists and what matters to us. Now, in the life cycle of the company, we were very much at the infra generalist phase. We didn't start hiring infra specialists until much, much later. So as a company, and this is a whole, I would love to give this talk a whole other time, we've gone through many iterations of our interview process, and one of the things that we've landed on, one of the options, is to have a take-home coding exercise. Again, a whole other talk of pros and cons, and I'd love to talk with any of you afterwards about how this has worked and how it hasn't worked. But in 2017, we designed a take-home coding exercise. And these are actually, I was looking up at the document from 2 years ago of the coding exercise, the grading rubric, and these were the things that the top things we really wanted to design it to test, so to speak. Now, it was also this really wild time at the company, and I made a really explicit decision, and I actually, in retrospect, feel like hindsight's 2020, it was the wrong decision. We decided not to hire product managers. So when infrastructure first started, like the engineers were like, this is the best thing ever. Like we were the inmates running the asylum. Nobody tells us what to do. Like we can speak engineer to each other all day long. And it's just going to be like this awesome party. And we're also under a lot of pressure. And Julia, you need to like hire a bunch of people. So I remember having a distinct conversation with April Underwood, who is our chief product officer, about product management for infrastructure. And remember, we're a product-led company. There are product managers, many amazing product managers all throughout the company. And I'm creating this organization that doesn't have product management that really relies on our engineers to help us shape the roadmap and help us decide what to work on. I think that's really important. And so the engineers were like, we don't need PMs. Don't hire them. We're good. We know what to do. And I was like, yeah. And then April says to me, she's like, you realize that if you don't hire any product managers, you're the product manager too. And I was like, damn it. It's like, as always, you're so right. So in the beginning, that was fine because the team was small. We had shared consciousness. We knew what to build. We were aligned on what to build. But then what started happening is other teams in the company would want to start better understanding our roadmap. They'd want to start building features that depended on critical infrastructure. And often, this is the early stages of feature development, so the PMs are often very involved with engineers and designers. So they'd be like, hey, we'd love to talk to someone from infrastructure. So I would go to these meetings. And then very quickly, I couldn't scale myself to go to all these meetings and have these discussions. So then I'd send one or two engineering managers. We only had 2 engineering managers in the early days. So send them. And then they kind of ran out of time to go to these meetings. So then I'd start sending engineers. And then they were like, oh, no. And at first, they were like, oh, this is really cool. But then they'd try to speak engineer to the product managers. And then no one had a good time doing that. So that was a really pivotal moment when I was like, okay, I think that we need to figure out our product manager hiring strategy. And then, like, as you'll see in a few minutes, like we eventually decided to do that. Now, I was also running programs the whole time. We do have a function at Slack called program management to help us run highly cross-functional programs. I was like, oh yeah, I'll do that too. I mean, like, what was I thinking? And we are an enterprise company. We're very customer-centric. We work closely with customers as well. And so occasionally customers would say, all right, I want to use Slack, but I want to have high confidence that you all know what you're doing and you know how to scale your infrastructure. So I'd have to go talk to those customers too. And it was just like thrash all over the place. So, so that was 2017. It was a wild year. They all are. And so now at the end of 2017, I kind of had this realization that this beautiful period that I like to call, in Silicon Valley parlance, 0 to 1, like 0 to 1 was over. And the original team had grown. We'd hired more managers. We'd absorbed some other organizations. And now it's time for this really fascinating phase of like 1 to infinity. And my role had fundamentally changed basically like every 6 months, from like line manager to like then line managing and managing a manager, and then managing some other managers, and then soon hiring directors and managing them. And there was this fascinating moment where it became not about a team or a few teams, but about an organization. And that's a very different type of skill, and I really had to understand what does it mean to be a leader of an organization. And that's a whole other talk for another time. Now, on the technology side, we experience really incredible growth in the maturity of these services. And usually we think, day by day, what are the breakages, what's going wrong? But as we grew, suddenly we were able to hire folks, no more single points of failure humans, have SLAs, have mature deployment processes, have a really well-oiled incident response machine. And so we were really growing up. And only at this stage did we really consider dividing into sub-teams. And what I mean by sub-teams was, again, we still had infra generalists. They somewhat moved fluidly across teams. Maybe some would work on caching, some would work on storage, some would work on traffic. And now we're starting to think, should we specialize, like have a dedicated storage team with specialists? That's when we're at the 100-person point. That's when things started to when we started to think about that type of structure. And again, I made a decision. When I talk to a lot of infrastructure leaders, they always want to talk about 2 topics. The first is, how do you communicate the value of your organization's work internally? Because they're facing a challenge where like they're not getting headcount or they're not getting budget. Or they want to talk about, do you have product managers? And so we did eventually hire a very senior product manager because we still struggled with what is the role in infrastructure. And I hired someone very senior who could help define that role. And one of the things that he did, which I found incredibly valuable, and suddenly the engineers had this aha moment, was, now how many of you you're on a team and you're hashing out, or you're watching a discussion hash out about a complicated feature? This is in Slack. People are weighing in. There's discussion. Someone brings up an edge case. Someone pastes in a graph. There's discussion. You think you have some consensus there. And then folks are like, OK, we're going to go build. Anyone have this kind of like, what I like to call building the product, like PRD, products requirement design or spec, through Slack messages. But what happens is, so we would have these like kind of fluid discussions in Slack, but we would never have a document, or in the rare case, we would have a document that would take that discussion and then turn it into an actual spec of what we're going to build and what not we're going to build. And so he started doing some of that work, and immediately it was transformative to the organization. I can talk a lot more about other things that he did if you'd like to talk offline, and how we're building out that organization within infrastructure, where we're super behind and we're really scaling it up. So if you are a product manager, we're hiring. Now I'm going to wrap up so that in case we do have time for questions, TBD. I think one of the other things that I talk to a lot of other leaders is if you're going through hypergrowth and your organization is growing really rapidly, it becomes hard to have coherency in vision and mission across the organization. And this is something I actually struggle with a lot because like you all probably have staff meetings with the leaders in your staff meeting. And I have this with like someone who runs machine learning and then someone who's working with the low-level JavaScript fundamentals in the client. And these two people are like you are alien to me. And that's actually quite hard when you're trying to build a team, a leadership team to help you scale. I have data infrastructure in infrastructure. We have what people typically think of as infrastructure. We call it core infrastructure, caching, storage, traffic. We also have search and machine learning infrastructure. And these are all very, very different pieces with different types of people. And so as we've specialized, this is something I'm still struggling with. And like, how do we organize the company? Again, I have no answers, just like things that suddenly hit when we hit a certain scale. So to close our time together today, I was really reflecting back on the past 2.5 years and trying to condense the stories and the lessons learned. And it's really like the team has been on this amazing ride. And so in those 2.5 years, like we run what's called our asynchronous job processing, our job queue. How many of you have like large asynchronous queues that you run? I think I've talked to a few of you about like how hard this is to do. So when you paste a URL in Slack, hopefully immediately, or with very low latency, you see a preview. And so that's going off to a queue, and it's fetching the data and putting it back in Slack. This is how we send emails. So the notion that we went from 400 million to 2.5 billion in that queue, and there were some rewrites in between that volume, like it's just amazing to me that this small but like mighty, amazing team did this. And then like DAU, daily active users, have tripled. Connected users, maintaining that WebSocket connection, rebuilding our infrastructure so we could support 7.5 million simultaneously connected. I mean, you build very different tools at that scale. Generalist to specialist. And finally, this talk would be amiss without me mentioning I'm not the person doing this. This is the team. And the team is absolutely amazing and incredible and the most talented people I've ever worked with. And they're the ones who are really doing all this incredible work. And so it's been an incredible, incredible journey. And so hopefully that gives you a flavor of some infrastructure things. Happy to talk more. Hit me up on Twitter or afterwards. And thank you for this wild ride of AV infrastructure.
Thank you very much, Julia.